bit of Donald MacDonald's setting from his printed book, The End of the Great Bridge. And at the bottom, the View Society score arranged by Archibald Campbell. Above it, as you were on the next page, got Liam Ross, The Battle of Passa Crieff. Also stuck in, for curiosity's sake, Peter Reid's opening sequence, and once again what the Pipers'Persuasion Society did with it in Volume 1, their second series, which came out in 1925, edited by J.P. Grant and Archibald Campbell, largely Archibald Campbell. Then we got the Battle of Atternish, Angus Mackay's ground, and Colin Cameron's variant on it, which I think is what Jim's playing to do, Colin Cameron. And once again at the bottom, what the Pipers'Persuasion Society did with it. We'll comment in some detail, but not much, at the end before Jim plays. And finally, from the Mackenzie papers, stuff coming down through John Ban Mackenzie and his nephew Ronald, various others of the second and third generation after John Ban, of the Earl of Seaforth, which, if you're familiar with it, which of course we all are, a mere glance will show you was timed rather differently from the thing. Now, since I've taken you through the handout, here is our actual formal, proper introducer, who will, without more ado, introduce.
Well, you're like a man that's sharp out the trap. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm standing in for Stuart Letford today. Stuart's ill today, so unfortunately can't be with us. This idea was really a gem from Jim McGillivray about a year ago, that proposal to the editor of the Piping Times then. I have to say that today's the first time I've had the pleasure of meeting Willie. He is someone, I suppose you would describe as a social and cultural historian and a piper, which is very interesting for us in the piping world. He's a native of Aberdeenshire, and his family are of Angus, the Mearns and Deeside stock, and he was raised with a very firm grounding in traditional piping and traditional music, period. And he was at Aberdeen University. He joined the OTC, and he was pipe sergeant and then pipe major of the band. And from 1969 to about 1977, he studied Pibroch under a well-kent face of the great Bob Nichol. And he also received tuition from Dublin University. Most of us will know Willie from his book, The Highland Pipe and Scottish Society, 1750 to 1950, and the book Pipers. It was his first book, Stuart tells me, on Jacobite's song, that really brought Willie to his attention. And Stuart is quite convinced that this was a huge influence on him while he was studying Scottish history at Glasgow University. The second book, The Highland Pipe and Scottish Society, is the one most of us will know Willie by. It's a comprehensive and a very thoroughly researched look at the history of pipe music, composers and compilers. And in truth, it hasn't been without controversy. Stuart tells me that Lieutenant Colonel David Murray still refers to it as his Bible. So that's certainly a very significant endorsement. After Willie provides his lecture, we'll of course hear some illustrations from the manuscripts played by Jim McGillivray. Jim is a well-known face in the competing world. I remember him way back in the 70s in the Guelph band, when under the pipe majorship of our dear friend Ed Nye, and who had an infectious enthusiasm for Pibroch, and And so therefore Jim found himself in a very good position when he was in the Guelph Pipe Band. He of course played the 78 Fraser Highlanders and came over to Scotland after a successful amateur career in Canada and won the major prizes, including both the gold medals and the clasp. He publishes music, and most of us will know that from his website. He's a reed maker, a researcher, and an adjudicator. In fact, he's going to be doing that later on today at the Masters competition at the National Piping Centre. He's the Piping and Drumming Programme Director at St Andrews College in Aurora, Ontario. And Jim will just give us a brief insight or a brief introduction to the illustrations that he plays after Willie has spoken. At the end of the day, all I would say is that I studied for 24 years under Donald MacLeod, and I had a very intense insight into not only Donald MacLeod the teacher, but Donald MacLeod the man, and Donald MacLeod the composer. And the one thing about Donald MacLeod that always came through to me, having been someone who was taught and brought up in the very traditional background of Piper playing in particular, was that a lot of people maybe missed the point that he did not have a closed mind. He was very, very open-minded about piping music in general, but in particular Pibroch. So therefore he used to say how important it was not to have a closed mind and to look at what other people and other manuscripts suggested might be the way that certain tunes should be interpreted. So enough from me. It's very important that at this stage I ask Willie to come forward, and I'm intrigued to hear what he has to say. Ladies and gentlemen, Willie Donaldson.
Right. The fact that we got a handout and we're looking at the relationship between written and printed music and what is actually played prompts one very obvious question that I've longed to ask to a skilled and experienced audience. Could we do maybe a wee survey before we start? How many folk here go to a written or a printed source first when they're looking to expand their repertoire or get a tune is not part of their frontline repertory? Got a show of hands? 1, 2, about what? A third. And 4, okay, getting on from nearly half. So may we assume that the rest primarily go to other people playing, to recordings, broadcasts, stuff like that. It's a fascinating question about just how literate the piping community has been down the ages. But I mean, mere technical literacy, mere fact you can read a musical score with ease perhaps, doesn't mean you automatically go to it for what you want. It means you can, but it doesn't mean you have to. It's interesting. Anyway, when I was a kid, mad keen on Pibroch, there seemed such a limited number of ways of finding out about it. If your own teacher or family did not play it, there were the games, of course, and the radio, but the only commercially available recordings were by John Burgess and Captain John McClellan. A couple of LPs on the old Waverley label containing 6 or 7 tunes. And I listened to them till they disappeared into a haze of crackles. And when I went to university at Aberdeen, I discovered there were people of my age who did know about this magical stuff. And one of them induced me to join the OTC, where, he said, I could find out a lot more. So, very dubiously, I went along. It was an extraordinary institution. The first night I was there, everybody else went off to training, but the pipers filled a couple of tables in the mess with pints of beer and sat down to blather, and occasionally venture upon a phrase or two on their practice chatters. And after a while, somebody said, "Hey, let's hurry up to Jeannie's." And so they bought another couple of crates of beer, slung them in the boot, and off we went to Jeannie's. This turned out to be Jeannie Robertson, the famous folk singer, who lived not far off. And the singing and the talk and the piping went on into the wee small hours. And I thought, hey, I could stand this army stuff. But the OTC had some very serious players. Indeed, some of the best young pipers in Scotland were in it. And I learned an enormous amount from them. In my time, it included Jack Taylor, Bill Witherspoon, a later president and secretary of the Pipers'Persuasion Society, the piping judge, W.R. Fraser, Ian Duncan of Vale of Atholl fame, the Pipers'Persuasion Society treasurer, Walter Gray, was in it, and Andy Hunter, later president of the Lowland and Borders Pipers Society, was pipe major when I came. And he was just back from a trip to Brittany. And he had a bombard. And we improvised a biniou using a stand of Highland pipes, and soon had a Breton long dance going up and down the middle of the drill hall. Oh, and amongst these great names was also Alan MacDonald, who arrived just as I was leaving. Now, most of these guys studied with the Bobs of Balmoral, especially Bob Brown. Bob Nicol had been ill and out of the public eye for some years at that point. And I used to go up to Garethall Shield with them in a succession of beat-up old cars and sit in on lessons. And after a while, I began to wonder about the mysterious Bob Nicol, and ended up going to him for 8 years. He's a wonderful man who agreed to teach me stuff that was not on that year's or any year's lists. And I got eventually 99 tunes from him. I used to go up on the bus, at first to Ballater, and walk to blacksmiths' cottages on the edge of the Birkhall estate a few miles further up the Dee. He didn't have a phone in the early days, and you'd arrange lessons through the local police. You would ring up and say, "Could I come and see Mr. Nicol on such and such a day?" And a day or two later, you rang them back, and they would say, "Aye, you're to come up at such and such a time," and then off you'd go. In those days, you could wander freely in the stacks containing the older books of the university library, and they had a good deal of pipe music. I remember Angus Mackay and William Ross, but I couldn't find Thomason's Kilmore, a legendary affair. I mean, Bob Nicol frequently spoke of it as the source of sources, and of his own copy being stolen out of the Piper's room at Balmoral. The library not having Thomason's seemed odd because of his strong Speyside connections. And one of the librarians spent an afternoon with me trying to track it down. We even tried the music department, where we were informed from a great height, "Oh, we don't do Scotch music, yeah." Eventually, I became pipe sergeant, then pipe major of the OTC, and used to go round to the unit every lunchtime to play. They had this huge Nissan-type garage with a concrete floor, and you got a terrific ring off it. At that time, I was playing a borrowed McDougall set of drones and Ian Duncan's second best Hardy chanter, reeds by Nicol. Anyway, one day, an old man approached me, he lived in the neighbourhood, and he said, "I listen to you every day. You play too fast, laddie, but you better have this." This was a copy of Angus Mackay's light music collection, The Piper's Assistant. And I thought, gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do or where I'll go after my student days are over, so this had better be deposited somewhere safe. So I donated it to the university library with written instructions about what it was, its importance, the fact that it was a first edition, I think the only one in the public domain, and it had better go into special collections. Therefore, years later, I found it casually on the general shelves in a mutilated condition, with 2 or 3 tunes cut from it with a razor. Some clown would have been a lot safer with me. In the early 1970s, however, the English reprint company EP of Wakefield in Yorkshire responded to the expansion of the higher education sector and the demand by lots of new libraries for copies of classic texts, and began to bring out the great old collections of bagpipe music at affordable prices. Photographic reproductions, so you're getting exactly the original. I showed this to Bob Nicol. I think it began with Donald MacDonald, and asked if Bob would support me if I wrote to them suggesting further titles. And on his advice, they brought out William Ross, Angus Mackay, Donald McPhee, and to me, the greatest prize of all, General Thomason's Kilmore. And they stopped before we could get to David Glenn. And suddenly, you could have copies of the core volumes of the historic repertory of your very own. No library regulations, no endless renewal of loan, no fines. And I began to play my way through them, especially Kilmore. I went twice through Kilmore, end to end, making notes as I went. This was inspired by curiosity, which had led me to the music in the first place, but also by repeated warnings from Bob Nicol about the inadequacies of the Pipers'Persuasion Society volumes. Time and again, he would say during lessons, something's wrong, something's drifted, they've written it down all wrong, and proceed to amend their scores as he sang and played on his practice chanter. He was scathingly dismissive of the Society's editor, Archibald Campbell, whom he dismissed as no musician and rank amateur. As I played these old scores after Bob died and made detailed comparisons with the Pipers'Persuasion Society volumes, one thing became obvious, namely that when they said a tune was taken from Angus Mackay or some other great master, it very seldom was. There were all kinds of changes to time and note values in the ground, usually not commented on in the accompanying note. So that if you played these scores thinking you were following tradition, you were considerably mistaken. I acquired an increasing distaste for the prevailing style of Pipers'Persuasion playing you heard at the competitions anyway. It seems to me desperately slow and laborious. And there was something very odd about the timing of the grounds. And they didn't seem to belong to the same musical world as the variations. You saw this quickly as a student of the Bobs. They would reach the variations and say, well, it's plain sailing after that. And the variations were flowing, often sweetly musical, and had a grand underlying rhythmical pulse. You know, the kind of thing, ho, 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 he, and hun, and ho, hun, and he, ho, ho, really unjust. And we could all replicate that countless times. But the all-important grounds of the tunes were different and were treated differently. They didn't make the same kind of obvious musical sense, and you had to find a teacher who could unravel them and take you through them note by note in all this cut-that style that many of us are familiar with. And only then could you call yourself a finished player. Indeed, it is well known that some very famous players, cream of the profession, have positively disliked Pipers'Persuasion. And the way it's generally played, you can see what I mean. Donald Macpherson, with whom I had lessons when I was in Glasgow in the early 70s, once said to me that people who affected a genuine interest in Pipers'Persuasion, you know, the kind of thing, oh, I do so love the Pipers'Persuasion, were nutters, his word. So there you go, Golden Donald. How many clasps? 9-ish. So here was a kind of paradox. On the one hand, everybody played from the Pipers'Persuasion Society volumes, and Colberry. I didn't have a copy of the latter myself. Bob Nicol was fierce in his condemnation of it. Said his teacher, Johnny MacDonald, wouldn't have it in the house. But most people thought, myself at an early stage, well, these are summative, these Pipers'Persuasion Society volumes. They contain a distillation of the wisdom of the ages. Armed with these, you need nothing else. And yet, time and again, the older collections, Ross, McPhee, Glenn, Thomason, not to mention the old manuscripts, said something different. and represented the tunes in what seemed a more sweet and recognisably musical way. So, what was going on? One problem was there was no adequate history of the society and its activities, so one had to be written. Following the usual method, first assemble the primary sources. It was obviously important to get inside the Pipers'Persuasion Society and have a look at their internal papers, so the resulting picture wasn't constructed entirely from the outside. But you couldn't just walk into the National Library where they were held and look at them. You had to get written permission first. This was highly unusual. Very occasionally, the National Library would take into its care collections with restricted access, in the belief that it was better that certain papers should be looked after properly at the public expense, even if not everybody could get in to see them. So, I wrote Seamus McNeill, who, as Secretary of the Society, had the say-so about who could get in and who couldn't. He didn't reply. So, I wrote again. About 3 months later, he wrote back, flatly refusing. Apparently, there was private correspondence mixed up with the Society's papers. As indeed there was, as I was later to discover, some of it strongly critical of Seamus McNeill. So, I sat down and waited till he died. And when he did, I wrote to his successor, who granted the required permission. The papers are very extensive and present a very interesting picture. From them, it was possible to reconstruct the history of the Society in considerable detail, and something quite startling emerged at an early stage, namely, that though the volumes of the Society's collection were published in the name of the Music Committee, the committee had no input, no oversight during the editorial process, and may not even have seen the books issued in their name before they hit the streets. The Secretary, Archibald Campbell, Kilberry, worked alone. He was sole editor of volumes 2 to 9 of the Society's collection, containing the heart of the modern competition repertory. So, the next step was to see Archibald Campbell's own very extensive editorial papers, also lodged in the National Library of Scotland, and these anybody can see. You don't need any special permission. And I spent several days going through them, and the results were disturbing. How Campbell worked was like this. He had a file for each tune, about 300 altogether. And in the file were copies of classic manuscript scores of the tunes and the versions from the older published collections cut from the original volumes. To these were added miscellaneous notes, historical details, and so on. Most interesting, however, were Campbell's working papers, showing often in great detail how he had arrived at the score he eventually published, and how regularly and deliberately he departed from the musical values of his sources, those very authorities he was citing in the accompanying notes to the tunes. Two things were particularly unsettling. One was how he tended to corrupt the grounds, lengthening quavers into crotchets and scattering the results with fermata so that the rhythmical pulse of his original sources was largely obscured. So he was slowing and coarsening the music as he went. There were structural issues too. Instructions to repeat the ground at various points within the tunes were silently omitted. And a cruel mach movement to every tune that could conceivably bear one, regardless of its character, was silently added. This included a cruel fosculture, a mach, hitherto virtually unrecorded, and denounced by many contemporaries as spurious. He tended to leave the note values of the variations alone. Their strongly rhythmical character was too obvious to be disrupted, but in the grounds, the basic melody part of the tune, his interventions were frequent and disruptive. His silence on the scale and nature of these meant that the scores were received as the authentic works of the various great master players and other traditional authorities cited in his list of sources, few or none of which we must remind ourselves his audience will have seen. To make arbitrary changes in a text without signalling that they have happened and why is about the biggest sin an editor can commit. And Archibald Campbell does it on almost every page. Amongst those in the know, the Society's papers show all kinds of ructions. Senior members of the Society, like Seaton Gordon and Somerled MacDonald, protested vociferously during the 1930s as the major volumes were appearing and urged that the whole edition be scrapped and that the Society should start all over again. Johnny MacDonald wrote, quote, "Our ancient and traditional music with all its beautiful and melodious airs and sentiment has passed into the wrong hands, and it will take a long time, if ever, before it can be restored to the original standard. They have killed the Pibroch." But the protesters did not prevail, and the Society continued to edit scores in the by now standard house style well into the 21st century. How on earth had this come about? And to appreciate this, we have to go back to the very early years of the 20th century. In 1903, the Pipers'Persuasion Society of Scotland had been founded by the brothers John, Angus and Archibald Campbell, a family of Argyllshire lairds who were enthusiastic amateur players and piping aficionados. Membership of the society was by invitation, and for many years it was overwhelmingly landed and titled. Professional pipers, i.e. the people who actually knew about the music and had taught the gentlemen amateurs all they knew, were expressly barred from membership. The Campbells had managed to persuade themselves that Pibroch was in danger. You could go round the games year after year, hear the same half-dozen tunes: The Glen Is Mine, Massacre of Glencoe, I Got a Kiss of the King's Hand, Black Donald's March, The Lament for Donald Dole Mackay, Mary's Praise, Glengarry's Lament. They concluded that this was because the actual repertoire had shrunk to dangerously low levels because the pipes had been banned after the Rising of 1745, and the music had suffered serious loss. The old families of master players had ceased to transmit it accurately, and there was a still wilder theory going round that they deliberately subverted it, with the result that the music had ceased to be understood or performed correctly, and that only their own intervention could save it. The thing to do was to gain control of the major public venue for serious piping, namely the competition system. And this was easier than it might sound, at a time when the benches at even the greatest contests were filled by brother Highland lairds deemed competent to judge solely by virtue of their social rank and general enthusiasm. Next, the range of material heard in public should be expanded by producing mandatory lists of set tunes as the basis for competition annually at the great events. Finally, the process of judging should be simplified by producing uniform standardized scores edited by themselves. The society prospered despite many ups and downs, and duly came to dominate the public performance of the music we know as Pibroch or Kilmore. Over the years, their scores, issued annually at first and later at roughly triennial intervals, accumulated and became the 21 volumes of the Pibroch Society collection, first and second series that we know today. There was also a single volume shorter catechism entitled The Kilberry Book of Kilmore, edited by the youngest brother, Archibald Campbell, which came to have equal authority and prescriptive force. Altogether, the Pibroch Society edition took more than 100 years to produce, and even then gave an account of somewhat less than the total repertory, usually estimated at around 400 pieces. How well founded was the Campbell brothers' analysis and the programme that flowed from it? Well, we might consider the failure to recognise that the problem might lie with the bench rather than the performer community, i.e. with people like themselves rather than the pipers, who were unwilling to put their reputation as successful competitors at risk by offering pieces outside the narrow range of tunes that musically limited judges were likely to know. In In terms of the scores themselves, the brothers were by no means operating in a vacuum. When we recollect the enormous extent of the published repertoire in Piebroch then available in print, including the works of David Blaine, Donald McPhee, William Ross, C.S. Thomason, most of them edited to a higher standard of accuracy and musical taste than the Piebroch Society was ever to achieve, the decision to publish its own scores could seem rather bizarre. We must be careful, however, not to generalise too casually about the brothers. Their position was not a uniform one. Angus Campbell, in particular, had a more sophisticated and culturally nuanced approach, as we shall see. At any rate, the Society was forced immediately to confront the usual problem of editing and publishing bagpipe music, namely its sheer scale. Everybody here is familiar with the phenomenon. Pipe tunes come at you like this, twiddly-bit, twiddly-bit, twiddly-bit melody note, twiddly-bit, 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 another melody note, and so on. Fiddle music is much leaner. There's little more than an occasional appoggiatura now and then to interrupt the flow. And fiddlers can get many tunes into the space occupied by a printed piece of pipe music, especially in an extended form like Piebroch. Then there is a problem with the musical variety of the earlier manuscript and printed sources. But typically of a traditional musical form, there was a great deal of variety in the music. No two sources did exactly the same things in the same way. To reproduce all the significant versions of many tunes in orthodox staff notation would have been prohibitively expensive as well as impossibly bulky. Therefore, a single composite score had to be arrived at, either by taking a bit of this and a bit of that and combining the leading features of multiple sources into a single printed interpretation, or to prioritize one source over the others and reproduce that, while giving some idea of the other styles and interpretations in the editorial notes. And this approach produced the familiar layout of the Piebroch Society publications down to the present day. The edit and score on the left-hand page, with assorted notes about some of the details and some of the other sources on the right. The first volume of the current second series was edited jointly by J.P. Grant and Archibald Campbell and appeared in 1925. Of the remainder, volumes 2 through 9, containing the bulk of the modern competition repertory, they were edited by Archibald Campbell, and following his death in 1963 by his son James Campbell, who continued the house style established by his father. The upper echelons of the Piebroch Society in the first several decades of its existence represented a very considerable concentration of wealth and power. Their backgrounds were predominantly landed, and they tended to be products of the top English public schools. They were described by a contemporary as, quote, the kind of people who could pick up a phone and lose you your job, unquote. And since their own members were sitting on judges' benches all over Scotland, it was a straightforward matter to get the Society's set tunes prescribed for the greater gatherings every year. So the initial objective of gaining control of the repertory was quickly achieved. Next, it was stipulated that only the Society's scores could be played at competitions within their control, and in a generation they were the only ones to be heard in public. The Society deliberately sold these scores at below cost, driving commercial competitors quickly from the market. And for many of the middle years of the 20th century, the Society scores were the only ones available. As it began to register, after a few years, that the repertory was narrowing severely in terms of expressive range and variety, some of the Society attempted to backpedal. Its secretary, the naturalist Seton Gordon, issuing a public statement in 1928 to the effect that any acknowledged setting of the stipulated pieces could be offered by competitors. And in 1952, J.P. Grant, the Society's president, publicly deplored that competitors continued to adhere rigidly to the Society's settings, but to no avail. The practice had become firmly entrenched and continues to this day. The fact that from 1907 the Society had paid leading teachers to teach the Society scores with special emphasis on their exact time values in classes all over Scotland during the winter months could not be undone. Many top players were involved in this, including John McCall, John MacDonald, William Laurie, Gavin MacDougall. G.S. MacLennan alone refused on the grounds that he would not compromise the traditional style. For professional pipers with their strongly seasonal patterns of earning, guaranteed money in the winter was a big deal. The society also directly employed Willie Ross to teach the Army Pipers courses at Edinburgh Castle from 1919 onwards. Ross was a famous Army Piper, and the context was strongly military, but the Army long refused to pay for higher instruction in the art, and it is not always recognised that Willie worked for the society and not the Army, and that it was society members who examined his classes at the end of each course. Finally, of course, society members headed by Archibald Campbell and J.P. Grant sat in judgment over the results of the major competitions. So, the society created an accurate and musically eccentric score, ensured they were taught to the up-and-coming younger players, and then penalised performers if they did not adhere to them. In about 2 generations, only fragments of the old expressive style survived, and the society's scores, with their crude and unrhythmical timing, had come to sound normal. It had all begun so differently. The brains behind the society, Angus Campbell, a London lawyer, the middle of the Kilberry brothers, envisaged it as a kind of select study group, which should adopt and promote the scores of General C.S. Thomason, whose great edition, Kilmore, published just a few years before, had used a brilliantly economical system of musical abbreviation to reproduce virtually the entire tradition in a single plump but portable volume. Thompson had distributed it gratis to many of the leading players, and Angus Campbell saw this as the great key to unlocking the riches of the whole traditional repertory. In a series of thoughtful, eloquent articles to the Oban Times, he declared, "We want to see fewer letters appearing in the papers complaining that one piper plays a tune one way and one in another. Letters talking about a committee, forsooth, to decide upon an official setting for every tune, and to provide for the damnation of every player of a non-official style, and the destruction of the individuality of piping, its most characteristic and pleasing feature." Those final words are worth dwelling on. Quote, "The damnation of every player of a non-official style and the destruction of the individuality of piping, its most characteristic and pleasing feature." Angus Campbell died in 1908 at the tragically early age of 35. If he had lived, we might have found ourselves in a different and better musical world. As it is, after a century of activity, the society he founded has ended by producing a musical monoculture in which everybody plays from exactly the same score, in exactly the same way, presided over by a Pibroch society which, beginning in a spirit of cultural liberation, has ended as a narrow, dogmatic, prescriptive, note-picking musical police. This is one of the unacknowledged tragedies of modern Scotland. This is a huge subject, and we have only an hour. There's fuller discussion in my book. That's why it's here. You can still get them. The Highland Pipe and Scottish Society, and in the online Set Tunes series hosted by Pipes and Drums, whose able editor, I'm delighted to see, is with us today. Right, the references are at the top of your handout. The pieces we'll discuss in detail, and Jim is shortly to play, are the Battle of the Pass of Crieff, Battle of Laternish, End of the Great Bridge, and the Earl Seaforth Salute. We cite a number of older printed manuscript sources, including Donald MacDonald, Angus Mackay, Colin Cameron, and Ronald Mackenzie. We've timed it for an impression of merely 2 of many tendencies in the editorial practice and institutional management of this music during the past 100 years, which have had a significant impact on the way that it is played and understood today. The first point is a gradual slowing of tempi. The idea that Pibroch may have been played a good deal more briskly than we hear at present. Next, we turn to the standardization of movements with corresponding reduction of expressive range and variety. The old settings themselves present difficulties of interpretation, but then so do the new ones. You'll see in your example, the Donald MacDonald setting there of the end of the Great Glen, end of the Great Bridge, is clearly marked slow. What does slow mean? Slow in relation to the rest of the tune, slow in relation to other pibrochs, slow in relation to music generally. In the contemporary MacArthur MacGregor manuscript, we find pieces marked animato, in an animated fashion, or vite, fast. Well, how slow is slow? And how fast is fast? A deal of work has been done by classical music scholars trying to establish for the 18th and early 19th centuries, our period, an overarching tempo giusto, a kind of general median tempo in relation to which fast would be fast and slow, slow. And their general conclusions are summarised for us by piping scholar Professor Roderick Cannon in his edition of Joseph MacDonald's Complete Theory of the Scots Highland Bagpipe. The Complete Theory, compiled about the year 1760, is our earliest significant written source and still amongst the most thoughtful. It suggests that in Joseph's time, that's the middle years of the 18th century, a time when great tunes are still being composed, pibroch grounds were not all played at the same speed. A stylistic feature uncomfortably apparent in modern competitive playing, where timings tend to flatten out into a single tempo monotonously slow. The second conclusion to emerge is that pibroch as a whole would have been played a good deal quicker than we hear now. We can read in the Oban Times, a wonderful source for piping matters during the later Victorian period, first half of the 20th century. Letters from older players looking back over their careers that pibroch had slowed significantly during their lifetime. And of course, there was institutional pressure for this to happen. Archibald Campbell declared in the Kilberry book, page 6, that, quote, slowness is a characteristic of Highland music, unquote. It is inconceivable that he had never heard of the real. And his preference, Campbell's preference for heavy rather than tuney pieces, is well known. This ultimately sprang from his belief that pibroch adhered to a uniquely Celtic aesthetic, such that the less it resembled the regular music, the better. And all of this had its effect. The arguments are long and often highly technical, but the bottom line is this. It would seem as if pibroch generally heard in public should be played at the very least 30% faster than it is commonly heard today, if it is to conform with what Joseph MacDonald and Donald MacDonald would have heard when they were growing up in Sutherland in an early sky. Second point we want to focus on is the way that editorial pressures have distorted the basic expressive vocabulary of the music by considering just one of the most important recurring movements in pibroch, the introductory and concluding gesture on low A, called the gairn or the elach, depending where it occurs in the melody, which in the official edition is rendered five pulse. In the publications of the Pibroch Society, the conventional movements from which the grounds of pibroch are largely constructed are reduced to a single standard form. General Donaldson recorded several different timings for the gairn or elch. The Society has one. And it appears in their scores wherever a low A double echo beat is sounded, regardless of what is happening around it in terms of melody or rhythm. The older sources represent it, as you will see on your sheet here, with the initial low A accented, and it will be played thus today, with the emphasis falling on the initial dotted quaver. Or the major alternatives in its cut version, the form usually favoured by Angus Mackay. Viewed in this way, it can be seen as at once to be merely one of a whole series of movements which can be executed at important thematic points in the scale, from A, B, D, E, F, and G. You find these throughout the older written record. So the distortion of the movement on A, following the Pembroke Society's adoption of it as their sole and unvarying form, involves wider disruption in terms of musical organisation by wrenching perhaps the most important of the whole sequence from its rhythmical bearings. Lastly, today, we'd like to touch upon the rich variety of expression we see in the older scores, musically pleasing ways of doing things that have not come down into the arena of public performance in the opening decades of the 21st century. Things like the interesting setting of the Earl of Seaforth's salute, from the Mackenzie Papers, showing the stylings of a variety of descendants of one of the great early 19th century masters, John Ban Mackenzie, as assembled by John Ban's pupil and nephew, Ronald Mackenzie. There are two features that may strike us. First, the dramatically upcut opening gesture from low A through low G up to high G. Offering the strongest possible contrast to the way the movement is usually played nowadays, with a heavy, not to say excessive, emphasis on the initial low G and conformity, often a too eager conformity with the value given to these notes in the official Pembroke Society score by Archibald Campbell. Imagine a typical modern chanter was hideously flat low G. Like heaving coals. The Mackenzie's cut up. Is the rhythmical footprint. Hey, right. Then there's also, in the same tune, the upcut timings of the Turla Krula Brebach variations, which, once upon a time, seems to be the standard way of doing them, although largely now displaced by the even quaver approach promoted by this society. To vary the beaten track a bit, we're also going to try something here, not directly specified in the score. We're going to move the third ground so that it is first stated between the Turla doubling and Krula singling. Nearly all the older sources repeat the ground at this point, a practice which the time demands of competition has long phased out, but which was an original and pleasing feature of the music. Now, obviously, in the old days, returns of the ground, sometimes after each set of variations, were not going to be played in exactly the same way. Here was one area where invention and taste were required of the performer, as we see in the old competitions at Falkirk in Edinburgh, where there might be a single stipulated test piece, but of which everybody would have offered a different individual version. Sometimes in the old settings we do see, as we see here, a series of grounds stacked up together by notational convention at the top of the tune, and it prompts the thought, could it be that here we're getting specified not only the ground, but the form it should take on its repetitions later in the tune? So that ground 1 might fall at the beginning, ground 2 after the Turla doubling, and ground 3 on the final summative repeat at the end of the tune after the Krula doubling. So we're going to detach the second statement of the ground of the Mackenzie score and bring it in between the Turla-Krula variations and see what happens. We're extremely lucky to have with us today James McGillivray, who's now going to play for us to illustrate some of these points. Jim?
Thank you, Willie. Just a quick word before I start. This idea came up between Stuart Letford and I some months ago, and Willie and I talked about it. It was really, I thought, I really used it as a way of coercing Willie to actually appear in public for the first time, I think, in front of a piping audience, as he's written his fantastic Highland pipe. We talked about some things, and we thought the best thing we could do is get together and have a visit. So I visited Willie and his wife Ruthie in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We talked about tunes, we talked about approaches. I said, Willie, how would you interpret these tunes? And he started singing these tunes. And I said, look, I'm going to get my phone out, and you're going to sing these into the phone. So he sang them into the phone, he played them into the phone, and I thought the best thing to do, given my nearly 50 years of traditional Pembroke training, was to basically make myself Willie's pupil for the last 4 months. So we've been exchanging tapes back and forth, and I've been trying to assimilate a style that is, I'm finding really intriguing. but has been a real challenge for someone traditionally based the way most of us were. I know we've had competitions where people were asked to play Donald McDonald settings, and I've actually judged some of these, and in retrospect, what I see, people were playing Donald McDonald technique, but playing the expression that Willie believes may have been played 200 years ago is quite a challenge. It's been one of the more difficult musical things I've done. I'm getting better at it, and it's intriguing enough that I'm going to continue doing it. I'm going to take the tunes in a little different order. I'm just going to play a variation to blow the pipe down, and then I'm going to play a little Waternish first. It's a short little ground, and then I will play the ground in the first two variations of the Battle of the Passage.
have time for today. In fact, it's rather more than we had time for today. Apologies to the next people coming in. I hope it's been a pleasant as well as an informative session, and I think we should all offer a no better way to finish than offering another warm round of applause for marvellous player James McGillivray, without which this wouldn't have happened today. It's all his drive and enterprise. Thanks.
Willie, on behalf of the College of Piping, can I say thank you for coming along today to give us that very thought-provoking dissertation, and of course to Jim for demonstrating clearly the points that you were trying to make. I think we should all remember that music is an art form, and that when we're presenting our music, we should concentrate on issues of emotion and producing a lyrical and sort of organic presentation when we're doing it. It's not just all about technique and all about the instrument. It's an art form, and it needs to be a demonstration of your own self-expression. And it's also interesting the way Pembroke as an element has been influenced by political and social conditions over the time. We sometimes as artists feel that art form, including music, is protected and develops and despite all these things, but it doesn't. That is the truth of the matter. However, Willie, that was a great insight today. Thank you for coming along. Jim, lovely as well, and if you're interested in selling these bagpipes, we can talk in a few minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.